Go home. No, wait, come back. It's hard to gauge what the United Kingdom wants from its expats. While the nation has historically been one of the more welcoming nations in terms of immigration, this was also a major point of contention during the 2016 referendum. The results made things clear. Britons wanted to reclaim the UK's sovereignty, and that meant ending the free movement. The choice had been made, and Brexit took place. Obviously, with the sheer number of expats living in the UK, there had to be some sort of compromise. That is, the expats couldn't just up and leave their new home. A lot of questions remained unanswered at the time, only to be answered now. Moving back home. What finally drove expats over the edge? That's what we're here to unravel. You've probably heard someone from the older generation complaining that you can't get anything with a tenner these days, and they'd be right, but not for the reason they think. Yes, inflation is a very real concept that is often portrayed as the decline of economic productivity. Would you be surprised to know that that's not the case? Inflation is actually one of the most misunderstood concepts of economics. The only thing that people get right is that, yes, prices do go up. So someone complaining that you can't get anything for £10 these days compared to a couple of decades ago wouldn't be wrong. However, to really solidify their argument, they'd have to show that they're also making the same amount of money now as they were a few decades ago. Take any occupation, a store worker, a plumber, an architect, and a doctor, their wages have increased over the past couple of years. The fact of the matter is that there are several ways to look at inflation, and wage push would be one of them. This means that when people start to earn more, they're also encouraged to spend more. That comes in the form of making the price of commodities higher than what it used to be. You'd think that it's counterproductive, and in some ways it might be. However, if people don't spend money and the amount of money that's circulating within the economy falls for 2 consecutive financial quarters of the year, the nation enters into a recession. That's a bad thing, and that's something economists are trying to avoid. So, no, you can't get enough food to pay for a family of 5 with a tenner these days, but that's because the family should make just enough to go fine with £100 spent on weekly groceries. Now that we've covered a general overview of inflation, recession, and how the economy relies on you spending more, let's talk about the state in the United Kingdom right now. The United Kingdom has experienced 3 recessions since the 21st century, and many more before that in the early 2000s. The nation experienced the Great Recession, which frankly impacted all major economies around the world. Next came the COVID-19 recession, which again impacted several economies around the globe. However, the 2020 recession was unique. It barely qualified as a recession, with 2 financial quarters showing a drop in average spending. GDP per capita began to fall in Q2 2022, the longest run of falls or stagnation by that metric since 1955. By February 2024, GDP per capita had shrunk by 4.2% compared to its pre-cost of living crisis peak. The 2023 recession was swiftly taken care of by increasing spending, plus a surplus of immigrants who raised the GDP per capita also boosted the UK's economy. But this was just a temporary solution to a long-standing problem. You see, while the recession might have hit in 2023, the people of the UK had been experiencing a recession-like life since 2021. And that's where the concept of cost of living crisis comes into play. Simply, we're talking about a socio-economic situation where there's high inflation and wages that haven't gone up. Again, the only way inflation can work is if wages go up with it. Otherwise, you're expecting people to pay inflated prices with money they don't have. Their lives, their living, are now becoming costlier, but they don't have the means to control it. A crisis. Living standards are squeezed to the point that people cannot afford the standard of living that they were previously accustomed to. The population becomes poorer than it used to be in real terms. As of 2023, there is a cost of living crisis in many countries around the world. The United Kingdom is on that list. If anything, it's been on the list since 2021. Several factors contributed to the cost of living crisis, including the worldwide pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Brexit. In 2021, inflation in the UK was lower than in the United States. However, the high inflation in the US didn't lead to a similar cost of living crisis because American households received stimulus checks which helped them cope with rising prices. By 2022, the cost of living crisis had become a global issue, impacting people not only in the UK but also across Europe, the US, and other parts of the world, including developing countries where the effects were considered potentially apocalyptic. Specific issues in the UK have worsened the crisis. Labour shortages arose after Brexit as foreign workers left, and households faced higher taxes. Since April 2022, the crisis deepened due to several factors. The household energy price cap was raised by 54%, and both national insurance and council tax increased. Brexit raised food prices due to more red tape on imports from Europe, disproportionately affecting poorer households. Additionally, unemployed people in the UK received less fiscal support compared to the average of OECD countries, and wages have remained stagnant since the financial crisis of 2007 through 2008. Another issue was the lack of long-term gas storage, which left the UK exposed to volatile energy markets. Household incomes, whether from wages or benefits, haven't kept up with rising costs. In April 2022, real wages in the UK dropped by 4.5%, marking the sharpest fall since 2001. By July 2022, inflation exceeded 10%, a 40-year high, with forecasts suggesting it could reach 13% by the end of the year. Energy bills were expected to rise by 80% from October 2022, from £1,971 to £3,549, but then Prime Minister Liz Truss introduced measures to cap these increases. On the 23rd of September 2022, UK Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, with the support of Prime Minister Truss, announced a mini-budget that included extensive tax cuts. The package aimed to boost economic growth and attract foreign investment by cutting stamp duty and abolishing the 45% income tax rate for people earning over £150,000 a year. However, the cuts were not fully made, leading to panic in financial markets. The pound fell to a historic low, to 1.03, prompting the Bank of England to raise interest rates, which increased mortgage costs significantly. By late October 2022, Truss and Kwarteng were replaced by Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt, and the mini-budget's proposals were mostly scrapped. Although the pound regained some strength, interest rates remained high, putting further strain on household budgets. All this to say, it's hard living in the United Kingdom these days. This might suggest one reason why expats are considering moving back home. Ironically, British citizens are right there behind them with their bags packed too. According to one report, it's estimated, based on 200 respondents, that 67% of expats believe the cost of living and inflation had significantly affected their financial situation. It further stated that rising mortgage rates combined with the risk of decreased property prices are prompting 24% of expats who own UK property to consider selling. 38% of expats have a family home in the UK, and 15% have rental properties with mortgages. Therefore, it's no surprise that 39% said decreasing house prices have significantly affected their financial situation. As the UK property market continues to struggle, almost a quarter of the expats surveyed were considering selling their UK property, which no longer feels like the best investment option for them. The most popular reasons expats gave for considering selling their property in the UK were to free up capital for other investments. At 34%, an expected decrease in UK property prices at 27%, and to free up capital to clear other mortgages or debts at 15%. Additionally, 14% of respondents stated that their rental income is no longer sufficient or that they cannot afford an increase in mortgage interest rates at 8%. A report by Currencies Direct revealed that 23% of Brits, equating to 12.3 million adults, were considering moving abroad within the next 5 years, with 12% aiming to do so within a year. The British Expat Report surveyed over 1,500 UK adults and 500 expats and found that 39% of respondents blamed the rising cost of living for their plans to move. The report showed that younger adults were most inclined to leave the UK. This potential exodus could significantly affect the UK's workforce, especially in key sectors like IT, healthcare and education, where 48%, 30% and 22% of workers are considering moving abroad. The report also analysed property purchasing power across 22 low-risk countries for money transfers. Using the average property price per square metre and exchange rates, the study found that Brits have the greatest purchasing power in South Africa, where £150,000 can buy 240 square metres. Spain ranks second, offering 85.5 square metres for the same amount, followed by Cyprus, Portugal and Greece. Despite some concerns, many British expats reported positive experiences abroad. About 38% said they have never regretted relocating, and 37% said they rarely do. Furthermore, 49% of expats reported improved mental health within 6 months of moving. But what about the expats who lived in the United Kingdom? British expats are considering selling their UK properties in order to continue living abroad. This would suggest that the expats who were within the UK would be selling off their assets in the UK for a fresh start back home. And that would be the case, actually. According to Poland's Central Statistics Office, the number of Poles in the UK has fallen by 98,000. There are now 695,000 Polish people in the UK, while Germany is home to 706,000. The Polish diaspora is one of the largest diasporas in the world, with many reporting the government's policies and overall lack of transparency for their move. However, in recent years, specifically since Brexit, many Poles have started to move back. This could be for a number of reasons, but primarily it's because the better life they had came to seek in the United Kingdom just isn't there anymore. The cost of living crisis has made it impossible to sustain themselves in the UK, especially when most Eastern European migrants are working menial jobs throughout the nation. In any case, seasonal employment used to be their best bet, but with Brexit and stricter border controls, that's not a possibility now either. But they're still a long way from home, and many Poles have resolved to live in yet another state, one that's still a member of the EU. German companies, especially in healthcare, logistics, construction and manufacturing, are turning their attentions to seek skilled Polish workers leaving the British Isles. Nothing quite feels like home, however, and a majority of workers who've been on the move since Brexit are now moving back to Poland. Data shows that for the first time in nearly a decade, the stock of Poles working abroad has shrunk by 85,000. The cost of living is one of several reasons why the UK has gone from being the hotspot to an unsuitable place for expats. However, when you couple the elevated cost of living in a country where you're targeted in rising hate crimes, it makes sense why expats would want to move back home. To preface this section, we have to understand that while hate crimes and racist attacks are few and far between and do not represent the majority, they do in fact exist and should be acknowledged. Racism has existed in the United Kingdom, or pretty much the whole world, since anyone can remember. That being said, several people believe that Brexit provided a sort of trigger for would-be perpetrators to take their ideas and make them into criminal realities. To back this up, let's look at statistics that suggest the 2016 referendum vote to leave the EU was followed by an increase in race and religious hate crimes of 15 to 25% in England and Wales. A 15 to 25% rise in recorded hate crimes translates into approximately 2,000 additional hate crimes in the third quarter of 2016 in England and Wales. To put this number into perspective, international hate crimes on a monthly level in 2016 hovered around 300 in Germany and over 400 in the United States. Hate crimes rose more in areas that voted to remain in the EU. The logic for this is that behavior is dictated by individual preferences, as well as by a desire to conform to social norms. Areas that voted to remain experienced a greater surprise by the referendum result, and this may have led to an increase in hate crime. There is a strong evidence that media, both traditional and social, played a role in increasing hate crime after the Brexit referendum. Both of these can instigate acts of bias through perpetrating or legitimizing stereotypes, and as a result, contribute to increasing hate crime. The increase in hate crimes after the Brexit referendum suggests that the result created a public information shock, which in turn led to re-evaluation of society's tolerance toward racist actions and induced some individuals to commit a hate crime. While the temporary nature of hate crime rise suggests that social norms can change quickly, this change might be long-lasting. Britain has become overrun with immigrants, and it was about time the people of the country reclaimed it. Although this sentiment was worded differently in different Leave campaigns, the sentiment remained the same. Immigration has always been a touchy topic in the United Kingdom, with several immigrants flocking the nation annually. However, the topic of immigration is also overly sensitized. Did you know that immigrants actually boost wages? But then again, no argument held up on the day of the referendum when the majority of Britons made the decision to leave the EU, effectively ending the free movement. Before we talk about the consequences of the decision on expats who lived in the UK, let's talk a little about British expats who lived all around Europe. Tension was rising long before the Brexit vote. During the 2016 EU reform negotiations led by then Prime Minister David Cameron, disputes rose between the UK and Eastern European nations over issues concerning EU migrants. This included debates on limiting in-work benefits for new EU workers and restricting child benefit payments, which primarily affected Eastern Europeans living in the UK. Migration, of course, became a focal point of the Brexit debate, often painted in a negative light. Former UK Prime Minister Theresa May described the level of EU migration as unsustainable, linking it to economic difficulties, strain on public services, and social cohesion challenges. Boris Johnson, also a former Prime Minister, emphasized the need for a new, point-based immigration system, suggesting that migrants were taking advantage of the UK. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán defended Hungarian migrants in the UK, stated they were working hard and not parasites. Similarly, Slovakia's then Prime Minister, Robert Fico, opposed any measures that would treat EU workers as second-class citizens. Poland in particular was proactive in encouraging Poles to return home and boost Poland's own economy. In 2023, The Guardian conducted interviews with 6 British expats who expressed their displeasure at Brexit. For them, the Leave campaign was a selfish campaign that took away the many, many privileges that the EU was offering its member states. In their case, mainly these expats had already built a life for themselves outside of the UK and were being forced to return. Forced might be an overdramatization, but the process for them to stay just became a lot more tedious. On that note, let's talk about the options presented to the expats who lived in the UK and had been living there for years when Brexit happened. To preface, Poles moved to the UK almost immediately after the 2004 enlargement of the UK. That would mean that by the time the UK formally exited the EU in 2020, they would have been there for almost 16 years. This was something the EU brought up when signing a deal with the UK. They had to give the expats at least a reasonable option to stay. Hence, the European Settlement Scheme allowed certain expats the option to apply for settled or pre-settled status. By the 31st of December 2022, the Home Office had received 7,040,670 applications to the EU settlement scheme. Of these, 89% were granted settled or pre-settled status, while 11% were either refused, invalid, withdrawn, or void. The countries with the most applications were Romania and Poland. While living in the UK is surely not without several perks, the fact of the matter is that the expats who'd spent a considerable amount of time in the country working there became members of the community, and calling the UK their second home were effectively robbed of the freedom of choice. Still, this was widely dismissed as an expected outcome of Brexit. However, based on how British expats felt, it seemed like no one was happy with the outcome. But there was a silver lining. The expats returning to the countries that they'd left because of a lack of work opportunities to find jobs already lined up for them. Economically, Eastern Europe has seen benefits from Brexit, especially in manufacturing. The decline of the UK's car industry led many manufacturers to move operations to Eastern Europe, where costs are lower and companies can avoid new import and export fees. For instance, several Japanese companies shifted their production to Poland and Hungary, and Jaguar Land Rover set up factory in Slovakia in 2016. Eastern Europe's continued EU membership and lower costs have made the region more attractive to businesses, further boosting their economies. The director of Germany's Centre for Automotive Research even noted that Eastern Europe is more cost-effective for production than the UK. As it turned out, the journey back from London to Warsaw wasn't as complicated. What do you think about Brexit's impact on the lives of expats?